Hello everyone, welcome to Live on Air with Stuart Mannins and myself tonight, and I hope that you're able to watch the broadcast and be able to feed your questions in, and at some point, if it's possible for us to tackle the questions, we'll do that. I'm just going to also send out an invitation to Dorothy just to join the meeting. There we go. Thank you. Just inviting Dorothy if she can. If you didn't get the other link, Dorothy, just click on this link and you'll be able to join our live broadcast through this link. So tonight we're discussing preaching for the 21st century, and there's such a lot in this that it's difficult to know where to begin. But I thought a very good place was with one of the prior questions that got fed in earlier in the week. And that question I'm just going to share with you now. And just bear with me while I bring that up in full. Tonight's question is come from Christchurch. And it's been asked, has the time come for the church to revisit both the content and the format of worship? Now, I think that's an excellent question as an overall arching question for a framework for tonight's talk. And I thought we'd just begin. Stuart's going to ask me a few questions in a little bit, but I'm going to ask Stuart to begin with. Has the time come for the church to revisit both of these, the content and the format of worship? What's your opinion, Stuart?
A very definite yes.
Any particular reasons for the definitive statement?
You know, it's not because I'm a preacher, David, as you know. I think the last time I preached a service in a Presbyterian church was about 50 years ago. But I have been a continual church goer and worshipper ever since, and I observed a lot of preaching. And my father spent every Saturday night preparing sermons for a Sunday service. So I come from that background. But I nearly got to the stage a few years ago of not going to church. In fact, I did for a while not go to church. And I felt there was a gap in my life, or both my wife and I felt this. And so we sought to find a church to go to. And in a long series of explorations, we ended up 20 years ago at the Methodist Church.
And during this lifetime, because you used to go to a Brethren church when you were much younger, during this lifetime of attendance at church, what has, in your opinion, been good about the content and the format of worship, and what do you think right now needs revising?
The good thing were, some people would call them the fruits of the Spirit. No matter what people believe, if they exhibit the fruits of the Spirit, then I see Christ alive in their lives. And that's the most important thing for me. But I was brought up to believe that what you believed really mattered, and what you did came from what you believed. Now I tend to think the other way around. It's what you do in following Christ's example, in producing the fruits of the Spirit, that really matters. And it doesn't matter too much what you believe, as long as you believe in sincerity.
And the format of worship, has that changed at all? I mean, okay, you don't worship in a Brethren congregation now, and I know to some extent it's changed in Brethren congregations, but overall, is your impression that the format of worship is much the same as it's always been?
It is, although there's a big difference here. Some communities change much more than others. And I was brought up in one that saw not changing as a virtue. You continued the tradition. You kept the faith. You didn't question. You didn't change. And I think that's completely wrong, and that's been a very inhibiting thing on many Christian communities. They have then seen the form as more important than what I see the essence to be.
Now, I think that's quite fascinating because a lot of people are caught in perpetuating old forms of worship. Content, by and large, I think does change because of the changing context of our times. So during the Second World War, there are lots of sermons about the effects of war and peace and pacifism and the like. But as we move through the latter half of the 20th century, new wars come in. And latterly, it's been the war on terror. I was at a synod meeting yesterday, and in that meeting, we were discussing religious education and should there be continued Methodist involvement with the Church's Education Commission, which produces the Bible in schools type material. I don't know exactly what it's called these days. But someone made the very strange observation, in my estimate, that we had to be very careful as Christians that we portrayed ourselves in the right light in the classrooms and things like that. And yes, sure, we've got to be very careful, but actually that's not an excuse for taking infinite time to prepare our careful case. Teachers have to deal with very young children through to those at the final years of high school who are vitally interested in the subject of radical Islam, for example. They're the ones that are living through the kind of terror attacks and the anxieties that produces. So I saw there someone who was really arguing a case for a world in which there's infinite time to take care, to get everything exactly right. And I don't believe the world is like that. I think we've got to do our best to get our message across in a pertinent and relevant way, but we haven't got an infinite amount of time to take care of every last detail. Any quick comment from you about that before we return to our set questions?
Oh, yes. If I were going to summarize what you've been saying, I think it is, let's get rid of the garbage and hold on to what really matters. Now, I've been lucky in that I've been a musician and an educationalist, and I've been interested in philosophy and science, and I see these other areas not being caught generally in the trap of maintaining a tradition, but changing with the times. And that's what we need to do in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to do this. Well, our discussion is going to move a little bit different now, in a different orbit now. You're going to ask me some questions because you wanted to talk about the kinds of things that I've been doing in worship over a lifetime. And I've put it this way, we're going to look at an overview of what we strive to achieve in worship. Now, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time doing this, but Stuart, would you like to lead in? You've prepared some work on this.
Yes, well, I thought about this in preparation and wondered how I could best support you. And I thought that if I could just recall why I came to hear you preach 20 years ago. I didn't know you. I had no formal connection with the Methodist Church. I wasn't particularly happy in the church situation that I was in. And you came and visited me and said, I believe you write stories for children. I'm interested in that. Why don't you come to my church and I'll teach you. I would like to preach to you and you might teach me something about working with kids. And I thought, what a great thing. So I said to myself, what decided my staying in Trinity when I came? And the first was the point I've just made previously 5 minutes ago. So getting rid of the rubbish. And you can read about that in my written transcript. That was my
Yes.
first thing about hearing you. I didn't have to listen to rubbish. Well, not much.
Not
Not much.
continuous.
Not now, the positive things, and I think you're right in summarizing this. I'd said you were interesting and informative. You've picked up the informative. I think you need to be both. And you made such good use of illustration, story, and music to stimulate imagination and feeling. You wanted people to feel things. And of course, that's necessary for the motivation for integrity. You need to feel you're doing the right thing. Now, that was the first one.
Yeah, I think that's a two-way process in adequate worship, particularly in the 21st century. As most Methodist congregations in the Pākehā world in New Zealand shrink, and we deal with smaller numbers of people, we need to be aware as preachers that there are different psychological types sitting in the congregation. And we don't want to go into, the whole Jungian analysis of personality type, but recognizing that probably the majority of people sitting in a congregation are there because of their feelings rather than there because of their thinking side of their personalities, means that we have to structure worship in a way that informs feeling. It doesn't mean that we don't address the thinking function of the personality, but rather that we have a this and that situation that somehow deals with the feeling side first and foremost. Then the thinking part of our personalities can be satisfied in worship in a variety of ways. I like to think of it like this, that the worship is like a stage, and that the spotlight falls at different parts of the stage, different times during the performance. And where the spotlight falls initially is on arriving at a kind of group feeling that makes it right that we have come together. Now, it's possible to get terribly formal about this, and calls to worship particularly can become overly formal. And we actually end up explaining to God why he's calling us to worship, and explaining to the people why they're called to worship, and it's become a perfunctory exercise. But to acknowledge the fact that people of goodwill have gathered, and sometimes at considerable cost and expense when they may have been going through inner turmoil, or they might have been going through periods of joy. But all these things have to somehow be gathered together and set the stage so that feelings are acknowledged in the initial phase of worship. Then there's a place and time for addressing the thinking function of every personality, and that's likely to be in the sermon. So we have to be informed about the psychology of type in the congregation, and we have to be informative about ourselves. I'm a highly differentiated thinking person, and therefore congregations need to know that I will address the thinking function at some point during the worship. Does that answer the question about what being informed? Well, that's at least what it means to me.
Yeah, and I would agree entirely with all of that. There's another slight issue. I just want to be informed about something when I listen to somebody else speak. I abhor sensing that people who are talking to me in a lecture, and I've been in many kinds of lectures, and with many of them outside the church, to sense that people are filling in time. I hate it. It wastes my time and theirs. So I really want to learn something when I come to any lecture, and church is no different. In that sense, I want to be informed.
Yeah, I don't believe that worship is a lecture situation, but I do believe that it addresses both the global and the local. And maybe when it's addressing global concerns, it most closely addresses local concerns. I mean by that, say, for example, we were talking about the 21st century ecology, and the global concern has to inform the local concern. So in a sense, all worship, yes, it's educative, but it's educative insofar as Christianity is both global and enacted locally. There used to be a very good phrase, think global, act local.
Mm.
Um, in my opinion, you have to uh, think global and think local, and you have to enact global by enacting locally. So if worship doesn't address global and local concerns, I don't think it's going to inform anyone.
Yes, I would agree with that, David. And there's a danger in polarizing these two things. They need to go together. We need to think global because we're part of a global village now. That's the nature of the world. But we need to have local concerns because we have our own particular individuality. And the two things shouldn't be forcing each other out. They should be working together.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the third aspect, Stuart. And my summarizing your questions, I ended up with this sort of one phrase, be brief. And it seems to me that at least part of the art of worship, the craft of putting a sermon together, has to address the fact that the attention span of people is not great. And the churches have, I think, opted into the wrong package here. They've opted into the 10 to 15 minute sermon package that they recognize that you've got to be brief. They don't want preachers that go on for ages and ages, or they've opted in to the lecture type situation that you were alluding to before. And in those churches, that's some of the Pentecostal styles of worship of the 21st century, you'll find that anything less than a 40-minute sermon isn't acceptable. You know, it might even be 50 or even 60 minutes. But I want to suggest that actually television and radio have this much better with their sound bites. That our attention span is limited, so we should be working at brevity and a lot of different activities in worship. We need to be concise rather than discursive. Any comments about that?
Oh, yes. Well, again, I'm getting worried. I agree with you on so much. It's not just being brief, it's the quality of the brevity. And I noticed that you could be brief. You see, I'm lucky. I've been conditioned by working with young children for a lot of my life. And I know the attention span of early childhood is about 1 minute for chronological year. I wrote
Oh, yeah.
many of those stories for 7-year-olds. Anything more than about 6 minutes long was lost in terms of their attention span. And it's good to have that kind of correlation. But the other thing I noticed about your preaching was the tone and the participation of those listening. You didn't adopt an authoritarian or a hierarchical relationship. You, I thought, established an equality where you expected some response from those listening in the same way that you're asking for a response from me now, and I hope getting a response for those others who are listening.
Yes, I believe very strongly in, I wouldn't call it a democratic process in worship, but I don't believe that you can have a sermon that is preached in isolation from how people have reacted to the content. And of course, this used to be very much the case in all Protestant worship. The preacher would ascend the pulpit, deliver the sermon, and once the sermon was delivered, you know, there was no further opportunity for discussion. And there are many famous instances of preachers using the pulpit to back a particular point of view. I heard an example of this very recently, where we were all called to change our ways of thinking and then not really given any opportunity to do so. So I do believe that there has to be a much greater opportunity for feedback. And that leads me to what I think is one of the main principles that I believe 21st century worship should try to encapsulate. Namely, that while we need to seek feedback from the sermon, equally, in our preparation and design of worship, we need to feed forward. So it's the prepared mind and the prepared heart coming to worship, the one that's looking wistfully for a word from the Lord. They may get it through any aspect of the worship, but who's seeking something because they have prepared themselves for the occasion. So there used to be, way back in the 70s and 80s, little groups of ministers that would sometimes gather together, and they would have a common hour or two thinking about the scriptures coming up. And that was fantastic because it meant sermons were not being prepared in isolation from one another. Rather, preachers weren't preparing in isolation for one another for the Sunday event. But that still didn't really feed forward as far as the congregation was concerned. And this is where I think worship has become static and, quite frankly, boring. What we've done with the common lectionary is assume that when we come to church on a Sunday, we will hear the readings, the lessons for the day. I would have thought that a much more creative use of the common lectionary would be for a study group or a cell group or a group of people preparing for worship to use the lectionary readings the week ahead. So on the Monday or the Tuesday, the study group would study what was going to be read in the scripture for the following Sunday. In other words, they're starting to prepare their own minds and hearts for the worship event. They're feeding forward into the situation. And once that worship event has actually occurred, then I think we need to seek feedback. Was the sermon's content actually relevant? Did it meet some of the needs and expectations? Let's move the spotlight away from the sermon and put it on the prayers. Was the attitude of prayer in the worship feeding on the concerns that had arisen in the week prior, and so on and so forth? So we're getting a continuous loop of feeding forward and feeding back. So that, I think, is one of the things that 21st century worship can do much better than 20th century worship, because we've got all these modern methods of communication that make for a far more effective form of communication.
I like the idea of associating feedback with feed forward. And I immediately think of my educational background when I had to do a lot of marking of tertiary students' work. And it seemed to me, if you're going to assess some work, that you give a reason why you're assessing it. And the reason for giving the reason is that people should then be able to improve from it. I remember being amazed when I came to your sermons that you used to ring me up and ask me what I felt of them. And I was a lay person. fancy doing that. Now, I'd worked in a department with about 10 or 12 adults in it, and I knew that the best quality lecturing was done when people, my staff, discussed amongst themselves what they were doing and went into each other's lectures and openly took part in discussion. Now, that was a very healthy thing when that happened. And when you wanted my opinion, not only was I amazed, but then I saw you used it to improve from it. This is the feeding forward. Very, very similar.
I'll just interrupt you at that point, Stuart, because I think we've, just in case people think I only sought feedback from you, that was far from the case.
Of course.
If I thought the sermon had been ineffective for that Sunday, I might have contacted 6 or 7 people and said, what did you think of that? Where did it succeed? Where did it fall down? What could I do to improve it? And it was constantly seeking feedback that made me, or it enabled me to feed forward. And I think it's this lack of interaction between preacher and congregation that's got in the way, particularly of the small congregation. And many Methodist churches around New Zealand, well, a number of Methodist churches, think that they're quite a big congregation because they've got 80 or 100 people at worship. Well, actually, that's a very small congregation. If we were talking about a 2, 3, 5,000 member congregation, exactly what I'm talking about would take place, but it would take place at a different level in the organization. The joy of the small congregation is that the preacher, be they a lay preacher or a minister, can get very intimate feedback in a way that benefits the whole congregation. And that leads me to the final point that we had on the second page of the sheet. And that final point was about encouragement. Worship in the 21st century needs to be about encouragement, but in a very particular kind of way. I think the churches, if they really start to look at understanding the feeling content of their congregations, they would move away from the warm, fuzzy type of affirmation. We're not in there for warm fuzzies. When I think in the 1990s or 80s or 90s, they started talking about, oh, you've got to give warm fuzzies in church. And there were a whole lot of really quite inappropriate things, in my opinion, that didn't enhance congregational life. Had they said, let's start to encourage one another along the Christian path doing certain sorts of things, I would have been much more comfortable with that. And I've now got to the stage where I really firmly, strongly believe that the power of encouragement in a service of worship is probably the single most important, influential thing that we can do. That power of encouragement can come in a number of different ways, but my hunch is the primary way of encouraging people is actually through music, through congregational singing, through making music on instruments, etc. I don't suppose that musicians feel that they're necessarily encouraging people when they play. And I don't suppose the congregation thinks of encouragement when it sings in response. But actually, the feeling effect of really good congregational singing has a tremendous community uplift of encouragement. Now, you've been a professional musician your whole life, music educator. Do you have any word that you would like to add to this idea of encouragement through musicality, if you like, in a worship setting?
Well, again, I try to see my musicality in terms of other parts of life, and the kind of encouragement you're talking of built group building, bonding together, is just like playing in a football team or a basketball team.
Yes.
Without thinking about it, you're all doing something towards a commonly held goal for which you need to give and to take and be part of. And that happens more, I think, subconsciously in music than probably, and to a higher level, than most other activities. When you get a choir singing or an orchestra playing or a whole group performing some music, there's something bigger than you that is important. And somehow you come away glowing from the experience and saying, that was good for me to be there. I could produce something that I couldn't do on my own, and I needed the others to do it. And that, I think, is an essential thing in terms of the spiritual life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Being at church is no different from being at a football match, in the sense that a group has gathered for a purpose. Some football matches aren't very exciting. Some worship services aren't very exciting. Well, those are the 5 points that I think the essential points that you wanted to get across. But I'd just like to share my screen again very briefly for the final point. Just bear with me while I bring it up again. There we go. And my apologies, I seem to have lost that screen share. It should be there. That's it. There we go. We've been talking about what we did in worship, and I wanted to end this live on air with what could we strive to achieve in worship. And I think one of the most encouraging things that I've seen in the last week was when we had a hangout earlier in the week, and we had yourself and Dorothy and Ernest Willis in from Riverton Union Parish, and they were talking about they've got about, I think they said 8 or 10 kids that are associated with the congregation, but they never come to worship, or very rarely come to worship. And Dorothy and Ernest had wondered, how could the local congregation connect with those kids? And they came up with what I thought was absolutely excellent. Absolutely excellent concept, and they were going to make a gift of goodies, if you like, a grab bag of goodies from the local church to these children. And for example, they might put in the bag a CD, and on the CD there'd be some of the PowerPoints that Dorothy had constructed about Bible stories. There'd be links to Dorothy's Google Drive so that the kids could go online and get, I should put up a Wordle resource. Now, a Wordle resource creates a word cloud. Many of the adults sitting in the church would not know what a Wordle was, but most of the later primary school children, intermediate age, would certainly know about Wordles. And so Dorothy had put resources that kids could go online for, and those resources are associated with the Riverton Union Church. Stuart and I suggested that Dorothy also look at putting in links to the SoMe Stories page, and maybe in the future badging parts of the work that are associated with that grab bag of activities. Kids love to earn badges. Actually, believe it or not, once you get into social learning, adults love to have badges too. Not because they want to show them off to people, but rather the badge is an electronic way of conveying information that shows what has been achieved. So when I had this question floating around in my mind, what could we strive to achieve in worship? It suddenly struck me that Dorothy and Ernest had broken free of the bondage, the static image of worship as something that happens in a church building on a Sunday morning. What they were proposing with their bag of goodies was that they would take church in a bag full of surprises out to different parts of the community where children were at, and where those kids got online and started doing some of the activities that Dorothy had put together, then the church and the message is being spread. In a real sense, those kids would be giving worth to God, because that's what the word worship means. It's an occasion where we give God some worth. And what we need to do, I think, is find many more innovative ways, like Dorothy and Ernest, where we just don't regard the Sunday morning event, which is by and large a static event. We don't regard that as the be-all and end-all of worship. Stuart, have you got any comments you'd like to make about that?
Oh, my mind's been going wild with possibilities there. And I thought of the possibility of in Riverton at the end of a year, for example, when children and adults had been working on their bag of tricks. And if they'd bothered to include my first Sew Me story in, what a wonderful thing it would be if they brought it back into the church, or brought it into the church to finish off, and did something that I remember the first time David asked me to speak about music education to Methodist ministers. I said, okay, I'll read them a story and then ask them to read it with me. And I read them So Me Goes Missing, and then we got from this group of 50 ministers or something parts, and we read it like a play reading. And it was quite hilarious. It really went extraordinarily well, although it was a book written for 7-year-olds. It went so well that the only time in my life I've said to an audience, I'm not going to count the books that I give you. I'm just going to hand them out, and you can find the parts you want to read and so on. I lost 5 books. They pinched them. These are Methodist ministers. To the utter goodness of one wrote to me the day afterwards and sent it back and said, look, I took this away and I shouldn't have. Otherwise, I lost $40 on that deal. But it'll work. And I could see that kind of thing, if you're interested in that material, working and coming back and displaying what your group had done through the year, just in that little play reading.
Yeah, I think the idea of the grab bag of goodies is particularly appealing. So people need to be able to put things out to kids in congregations and to adults as well. Stuart, just to draw us to a close, I'm going to share my screen with you. And here we go. In Six Senses, we've got pages that individuals create. There are a couple of thousand pages in Six Senses. Some of them haven't got much on. There'll be a profile page. Not everyone fills out the profile page, but for those who have filled it out, they can start to do things with their profile page that allow them to feed journals out, to display badges, other things, MOOCs that they might have done, and so on and so forth. Way back, I created a series of pages separate from my profile page, and it's called Sermons Old and New. And notice what I did there. To see all the titles, I just clicked on the little ellipsis, the 3 dots, and there is a small collection of some sermons that I've preached. And if we take the one, A Christmas Stocking Stuffed with Science, this to me was one of the most important sermons that I ever preached, because not because I preached the sermon, but because I learned something in the preparation for what would I say on Christmas Day. And the title of the sermon says, Sermons on Christmas Day? No thanks. But how about a lecture on science for children on Christmas Day? And the idea seemed ridiculous, but I decided to try it. After all, it wasn't a new idea. It had a significant history. And if you've been brought up in England, you would be aware of the Faraday lectures, which are broadcast by the BBC either on Christmas Day or Boxing Day. I think it was Christmas Day for the BBC. There'd always be a lecture on science for kids. And it seemed to me the most natural thing in the world, once I started to think about it, to be able to do little bits of the science of Christmas. And so my point in illustrating these sermons is that each one of them actually broke boundaries for me. For example, Marx and Engels, are they not today's prophets of God? Or certainly they were prophets of God for the late 19th and early 20th century. The time travelers, what does it mean to fall into the center of the universe, which is something that is exciting out in the world of science today? Everyone talks about the Big Bang and the kinds of things that went on in the making of the universe, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of these now, but you'll notice that at the bottom of the page, people can place feedback on a sermon. So what I'm going to encourage the people that are watching or maybe watch the recorded broadcast of this live on-air hangout is it's time for you to start putting up your sermons, writing them up. They don't have to be great lengthy sermons. You need to edit them so that they're concise, they're brief. You need to find some pertinent images that go with them, and let's start putting them up in Six Senses, your collection of sermons, old and new, because preaching is a craft that will not be dying out anytime soon. The content of worship, the format of worship, the delivery of a sermon may change. It may change from being read in a pulpit on a Sunday morning to being broadcast live on air any day of the week to who knows who throughout the World Wide Web. The important thing is that we are doing it and sharing our resources with one another and being stimulated by one another to take the message on, because I think the message is as important today as it was when it was first delivered by Jesus way back then. Now, Stuart and I have been working on a series of resources that we want to put out to you. If you'd like to join us tomorrow, you'd have to enroll in the Methodist Studies group, but we'll be talking about a very exciting project that we would hope a number of you could begin instantly in terms of getting your content out there and starting to be shared on a much wider basis than just Sunday morning in the pulpit. Stuart, thank you very much. I'm looking forward next week to bringing Professor Mark Orams in for a live on-air session on ecology. Stuart will be leaving us and we'll be having one or two extra people in with Mark. So you'll get a notification about that during the week. I'd like to say thanks, Stuart, and good night.
Good night.